Hi, I'm Jennifer Branch. One of my favorite things to do is paint the woods. It is ever changing, something always gorgeous to see. So come with me and take a walk in the woods in a painting.
I'm using twin rocker paper for this gorgeous woods path. I start out with a light wash, very loose strokes of azo yellow. I want a nice clear gold over the upper part of the painting where you go into the distance there. In the lower part of the painting, I have a much cooler with cobalt blues and cobalt violets. I'm using my mop and I am just letting my brush dance. This is a really fun part of the painting, but it's also critical that you get it right on this go. So very cool, very loose, and then I start pulling the cools into the warm area for the tree trunks. And now, after it's dried just a tiny bit, because it does dry in areas as it goes along, I start using some azo yellow for the first layer of the trees. And since this is backlit, I've got these wonderful leaves that are just glowing gold. Then over the glowing gold leaves, while they're still wet, I layer in a little bit of the azo yellow mixed with some quinacridone rust, and that gives it the golden brown. I've got a lot of the beech leaves here that early spring, late autumn. This one is very late autumn. They're still just glowing with that color. Now, you have to have some splatter, right? But this helps loosen it up, and also it gives you, this painting is a lot about texture. It's about the backlight and the gold and cool contrast, but it also is a lot about texture, which means I'm going to be doing a lot of layers in this painting. This is going to need multiple washes with it drying at least partially in between those washes. And I'm going to be switching out brushes a lot more. And trust me, you need a good quality paper to do this on because you want to be able to pull the paint out when you need to. So I'm just letting my brush dance around here. And if you splatter paint and you don't like it or you feel like it needs a little bit more, it's very easy to just go back with a brush. That's what the brush is for. The splatter gives you a bit more texture very naturally, but it's more forced than it looks. It's fun to do. I mean, but all painting's fun to do, but it's a bit, I know where it's going. We'll just put it like that. Okay, there's this single little beech tree at the end of the path area that is just beautiful. It's glowing with color. And don't forget, you always look at what you're painting, even if you change it up a bit. Now I've got the warm background and the cool foreground. And so all I need to do is I will introduce cools to the top because, I don't want it to look like it's striped, right? So I'm using a little bit of the cobalt violet, but notice that the cobalt violet, when used with the quinacridone rust and the other warm colors underlying it, it's very different. I always keep a rag and I blot and get my brush strokes just right. So a little bit more warms in here. And really, I'm just thinking of the shapes of the trees. You always think about the shapes of what you're painting, right? And these shimmery leaves and the straight tree trunks. And this is mixed. It's mostly beeches. There are a couple oaks, but the oaks aren't as much of a issue here because their leaves are gone. So you just see the trunks, and loblolly pines. So I've got these tall, dark, purpley, dark tree trunks, and the shimmery leaves and bare leaves, and just a hint of the greens in the background. So it's an interesting sort of mix. So I want to keep in mind the worms on the top where I'm heading towards on the path. And the path is actually interesting because it's very cool. It's remarkably cool for a woods path. It's kind of a bluey violet color. And on either side of it is the leaf litter, and that is a dark, rich brown, but it's also very, very cool. And it isn't what you think of. It isn't the colors that you think of when you think of a path like this. So I've had to mix it up a little bit more with this one. So I want a lot of texture. I've got my nice cool background on there, and I don't want it to get too warm. So I've mixed the quinacridone rust with a bit of the cobalt violet. As you can see up here, it's just, I've mixed everything up, and I'm pulling the same color into the background by just the tree trunks, so they're kind of the connection between the two areas of the painting, because, once again, not looking for stripes. So woods are really interesting to paint. They're pretty complicated because there's so many layers there. So I'm not even bothering with a rigger here. I'm just using my mop because I just want some very, very loose strokes. So I get kind of a greeny color with the azo yellow added to it. So it's quinacridone rust, a little bit of cobalt blue, a little bit of cobalt violet, and quin rust, and then a tiny bit of the azo yellow, and it makes this wonderful tree trunk color. But notice all the tree trunks are different colors, and this is still the first layer, and it's all backlit. So that means you want it a whole lot more golden than the shadowed area of the trunk, which you'll paint next. This is really interesting, how the trees are all kind of curving. It isn't too long after a storm, so there's some trees down, but there's also some trees that are just curving. I thought this was really interesting because they were curving just to give me a path here. It just emphasized the path. It had the cathedral type direction. Now, another problem with all these tree trunks is on a design standpoint, they are just pointing you directly out of the painting, right? We've got these big, tall arrows saying, leave the painting, leave the painting. And so you have to soften them. You have to soften them strategically because you don't want it to look too forced. I used a wax crayon over a lot of the areas of the leaves, and that's part of the layering and the texture. I just let the crayon move around, and you can use a birthday candle that's white or clear white or anything like that, and lots of options out there, and it will resist the paint, but you cannot remove it. So you need to make sure that if you really want that texture where it is. And I rarely use it on just white paper. I mostly use it on a couple layers in. So now I'm going over that wax crayon, and you can see all the different brush strokes I'm using. So I'm using a rigger, I'm using the mop, I'm just letting my brush move around, I'm doing some broad sweeps of strokes and little tiny rigger dancing strokes for the background. This bright green is azo yellow and cobalt teal mixed a bit. And I just want little hints of the green. Late fall, and there's hints of a lot of different colors in this forest. So this is really the texture part of it. And texture takes layers. It takes a lot of brush work. But just let your brush dance. Have fun with it. So a bit more dark, so I want to emphasize the slope of the hill there. You can see where it goes down to a creek on the far right. So very, very steep area, and the darks back there at the kind of the little valley, the little hollow there, that will emphasize that hill. There's a beech tree there, and I'm trying not to get too many golden colors on it. I do want to soften it a bit, but I don't want it to be a gold color because they're really more of a greenish color, and so you don't want it orange. Green and orange do not work together. They make mud. Okay, so down with a little bit of detail, with down to a little bit of detail in the focal point at the end of the visible path. So I want some stripes across the path, the shadows left by the trees. And this is going to be built up in layers as well. Very, very textured painting. And sometimes I let it dry. Mostly I've just painted enough and it's time to pause for a second. So this painting took about 2 hours plus drying time. Now, this is a little bit of a tricky area because I want the warm colors, but I'm painting the shadows on the path. But this is the area that it segues too warm. So I'm using a lot of the quinacridone rust because that can go either way depending on what the later layer is. And I do want some strong darks here, but not too strong because it's not as dark as towards the path towards me where it's closer. It is a bit in the distance. But the greatest contrast in the painting should be at your center of interest, and here it's the end of the path there. So pull some of the color into the tree trunk. Now playing with the mop again, and you can see my palette is quite messy. I wanted a little bit more fuzz. I thought that was didn't go up quite as high as it should, and it wasn't a soft enough transition right there. So I'm doing a little bit of azo yellow and a little bit of the mix with the cobalt violet and quin rust and everything else. So in very loose, very subtle transition here. I've wanted it very subtle, and that's going to make the cooler colors, not too cool, but cooler greens are going to make the golds really stand out more. More cobalt violet, some ultramarine blue. So I'm ready to start doing some stronger darks now that I've got my underlying value pattern and texture. Not detail, texture. There's a difference. So this one's a loblolly pine. So it's the deep, dark, purpley blue of pine tree. Actually, they really change a lot depending on the light. They can be very pale, more purple, more blue, sometimes brown. But notice right there, it's an arrow pointing me out of the painting up at the top. It's not going to stay that way. Don't worry. So I'm going to paint a lot of these edges harsher and then go back and pull out some paint, soften them. This has a lot of texture work and a lot of fussing with it. Most of the painting is actually in the end and fussing. But notice I have left a lot of the background loose. You can still see the background in there. I'm not using any staining colors, and this is a trick. I'm not using any staining colors in the heavy darks of the tree. Because if I use staining colors, I can't pull them out. And don't forget to always look at what you're painting. Okay, now I'm softening that area up there, and this is a critical step. You have to do this. You can do it more or less subtly, but you have to soften that area. Now some more darks. Okay, so I'm doing the beech here, but notice it is green darks, and then I'm going back around with the little horizontal rings, and there's going to be a couple layers of that. There's a tiny bit of wax on there to keep some of the whites, but it's mostly pulling it out because I didn't want it to be a harsh white or any color really. More darks down on that side. Time to do a bit more detail in the background. Most detail is usually around your center of interest, so I want some of it there, and also enough to give me that slope down and the slope of the hill up, and just point me where I'm going to. A couple bright greens just to liven things up a bit. Remember, the pine trees are green all year, so you do have those dark greens as well. Some deep darks on the path now, because it is going to be darker closer. And just kind of, that was another line that was pointing me out of the painting. I want a couple strong darks. Remember, it dries lighter, so don't be afraid to be bold when you're putting your darks on initially. Soften them up with some Quin Rust. Actually, more break them up with Quin Rust. That tree root. Now everything's flowed together and dried a bit. playing with the tree root. I don't want too much emphasis on that tree root. It's right there in the middle, and I don't want it to distract me on the way to the center of interest. So I'm switching brushes up a lot in this one, as you notice. A lot more brushes than I normally use. You don't need all the brushes. You do need the good paper, so use Twin Rocker if you can, and use Arches. An Arches rough would be the ideal paper for this. Otherwise. I live in the woods, so I love sketching the woods. It's something that I do at least once a week, and it's just very relaxing. But they are difficult to paint. There are many, many layers and many subtle colors in there. And with painting, you can paint it subtly, but it's nice to emphasize things a little bit so your eye gets directed where you, the artist, want the viewer's eye to go to. So they're complicated, but they're really fun to do. Whenever you paint a woods painting, I would be prepared to paint several layers, even for a sketch, because you're not going to capture that wonderful feeling of the woods without the extra layers like that. That would be very difficult. So allow for drying time. Switching brushes up and some splatter paint again. Now this tree right here that's framing needs to be re-emphasized. Remember, I told you we were going to go back on all the trees and really show the shadows after the backlighting. So, and then I want to add a bit more tree texture and details with the rigger. With the little tiny branches going out that I really didn't do much with, but just playing with. And that is about it.
I hope this inspired you to paint your own walk in the woods. If you have any questions or want to look at the reference photo, please visit my website, paintingwatercolor.com. If you like it, please give me a thumbs up or leave a comment and tell me what you would like to see more of, because I want to know. Next week, I'll have that cute little tufted titmouse that was the other side of my journal, and let me know what you'd like to see next. Thank you very much for watching. Happy painting.